Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1909, and the remote hills of the Ozarks harbored secrets that would never see the light of modern scrutiny. The Caldwell residence stood 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, nestled against the backdrop of dense forest and rolling limestone formations that defined the region. The home itself was a testament to the family's prosperity. A grand 2-story structure built in the neoclassical style with imposing white columns supporting the front porch, highly unusual for the area where most locals lived in simple log cabins or modest dog-trot houses. Jeremiah Caldwell had made his fortune in timber and mining during the economic boom that followed the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s. By 1909, the Caldwell name was spoken with reverence throughout Camden County. His wife, Lucinda Caldwell, was a woman of refined tastes who had been educated in Boston, another oddity in a region where formal education for women remained uncommon. Together they had transformed what was once a simple homestead into an estate that would not have looked out of place in the wealthy neighborhoods of St. Louis or Kansas City. The family was known for their private nature, rarely venturing into town except for essential supplies and never participating in community gatherings. Their isolation wasn't particularly remarkable in a region where geographical barriers naturally separated families across the rugged terrain. What would later perplex historians was how a family of such means could vanish so completely from public record, as if the very hills had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only whispers and a house that no one would inhabit for long. The first documented mention of something unusual at the Caldwell property appears in the county records from April 1909. Martin Reynolds, the local postmaster, noted that mail had been accumulating for weeks with packages from St. Louis containing expensive furnishings left unclaimed. Reynolds dispatched his assistant to deliver the parcels directly to the Caldwell residence. The young man returned ashen-faced, claiming the house appeared abandoned, though the doors remained unlocked and lamps were still burning inside. Most troubling was his account of hearing what he described as a persistent tapping from somewhere within the walls. This initial report might have been dismissed as the imagination of an impressionable youth, had it not been corroborated by Reynolds himself, who visited the property the following day. His official statement, recorded in the county ledger and preserved in the state archives, described the house as being in a state of peculiar abandonment, not as though vacated with purpose, but rather as if its occupants had been suddenly called away in the midst of their daily routines. Reynolds, too, noted an unusual atmosphere within the house, describing it as oppressively silent, yet somehow not empty. When county officials finally conducted a formal welfare check in early May, they discovered a home that appeared to have been vacated in haste. The dining table was set for a meal never consumed, with plates of food now transformed into unrecognizable mold. A ledger found in Jeremiah Caldwell's study contained increasingly erratic entries, the final one dated April 17th, simply reading, "They're in the walls now. Lucinda insists she can hear them breathing." Throughout the house, officials found evidence of normal daily life suddenly interrupted. In the kitchen, bread dough had been left to rise until it spilled over the edges of its bowl, now hardened into a fossilized mass. In the parlor, a book lay open on the arm of a chair, a half-finished cup of tea beside it. Upstairs, the bed in the master bedroom remained unmade, nightclothes laid out as if in preparation for sleep that never came. What struck the officials most forcefully was not what they found, but what they didn't find. No signs of struggle, no evidence of violence or forced entry. Whatever had befallen the Caldwell family, they had not fought against it. This absence of resistance would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, suggesting something so beyond ordinary understanding that it had rendered the family incapable of self-preservation. The inspection also revealed several peculiarities that defied easy explanation. Throughout the house, officials discovered small openings in the walls, particularly along the baseboards and near the ceiling. Openings that did not appear to be the result of structural damage or decay, but rather seemed deliberately created. These openings, ranging from the size of a silver dollar to large enough for a small animal to pass through, had been concealed behind furniture or draperies, as if the family had attempted to hide their presence from visitors. Even more puzzling was the discovery in the basement. The stone foundation of the house contained a narrow archway, roughly hewn and leading to what appeared to be a natural limestone cavern extending beneath the property. This passageway had been recently sealed with a makeshift barrier of furniture and boards, secured with heavy nails driven at odd angles, suggesting frantic, hurried work. When officials removed this barrier, they found only darkness beyond, a darkness that seemed, according to one written account, to push back against the light of our lanterns. What followed was a series of investigations that yielded no concrete answers. Local authorities initially suspected foul play, possibly at the hands of rivals in the timber business. However, no evidence of violence was discovered. The family's valuables remained untouched, including a considerable sum of cash in Jeremiah's desk drawer. Their horses were found well tended in the stable, suggesting whoever had fed them had done so recently. Yet, the family, Jeremiah, Lucinda, and their 2 servants, had seemingly evaporated without a trace, leaving behind a house that felt both abandoned and occupied simultaneously. Sheriff Donovan Richardson, the lead investigator, ordered a thorough search of the surrounding forest, employing local hunters and their tracking dogs. The search party combed a 5-mile radius around the property, but found no evidence that the family had left on foot. The only unusual discovery was made approximately a quarter-mile from the house, a perfect circle of withered vegetation, roughly 20 feet in diameter, within which nothing grew. The hunter's dogs refused to cross this boundary, whimpering and retreating when brought near it. The case might have remained a simple, unsolved disappearance were it not for what happened to the property in the months that followed. 3 different families attempted to purchase and occupy the residence between June and December 1909. None stayed longer than 3 weeks. Each departed in a similar state of distress, citing unnatural coldness in certain rooms and sounds of movement within the walls. The 3rd family, the Prestons, left behind a journal detailing their experiences, including accounts of strange whispers coming through the walls that seemed to be calling their names. The Preston Journal, currently housed in the Missouri State Historical Society archives, provides the most detailed first-hand account of the phenomena experienced by subsequent occupants. Abigail Preston, the family matriarch, kept meticulous daily records of their 3-week stay in the house. Her entries began with optimistic descriptions of the property's grandeur and potential, but quickly devolved into increasingly disturbed observations. July 17, 1909. Howard insists there are voices coming from behind the plaster in his study. At first, I believed this to be merely the imagination of an overworked mind, but this evening I heard it too. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails against wood, moving horizontally along the wall of the upstairs hallway. When I pressed my ear to the wallpaper, the sound stopped immediately, resuming only when I moved away. July 19, 1909. The north bedroom is unnaturally cold despite the summer heat that makes the rest of the house nearly unbearable. Howard placed a thermometer in the room this morning. By afternoon, the mercury had dropped so low it was no longer visible in the gauge. When he retrieved the instrument, it was covered in a fine frost, despite the room itself showing no visible signs of moisture. July 23, 1909. Howard now refuses to sleep alone. He claims to hear whispering coming from behind the headboard. I hear nothing, but the look in his eyes when he describes it chills me more deeply than the cold spots ever could. The final entry, dated July 28, 1909, simply reads, "We are leaving at first light." May God have mercy on whoever comes after us. The family departed so hastily that they abandoned most of their belongings, which remained in the house until county officials cataloged and removed them in August. By 1910, the Caldwell house had gained such a sinister reputation that the county recorder had trouble finding buyers willing to take on the property. It stood vacant for nearly a decade, becoming a subject of local legend and forbidden dares among the youth of Camden County. What makes this particular case fascinating is not merely the disappearance itself, but the systematic way in which the Caldwell name began to fade from community consciousness, as though erased deliberately from collective memory. In the county archives, there exists a curious document dated December 1911, a letter from a Dr. Augustus Fletcher of the Missouri State Psychiatric Hospital inquiring about a patient who claimed to be Lucinda Caldwell. According to Fletcher's correspondence, the woman had been found wandering near the railway station in Jefferson City, disoriented and suffering from apparent amnesia. Her only possessions were the clothes she wore and a small leather-bound book containing pressed flowers and cryptic notations. Fletcher noted that when questioned about her family, the woman would only repeat the phrase, "The house digests slowly." The county clerk responded that no person matching the woman's description had been reported missing, and that the Caldwell residence had been unoccupied for some time following the family's relocation to Colorado. A curious assertion given that no record of such a relocation exists in any official documentation. More peculiar still is that this exchange of letters appears to be the final official mention of the Caldwell family in county records. All subsequent documents referring to the property identify it simply as the old house on Briar Creek Road. Dr. Fletcher's medical files, unsealed in 1972 after the standard 60-year confidentiality period, revealed disturbing details about the woman believed to be Lucinda Caldwell. She remained at the psychiatric hospital for 3 years, during which she exhibited behaviors that baffled the medical staff of the time. She would only sleep pressed into corners of her room, insisted on blocking any cracks or vents with strips of cloth torn from her bedding, and spent hours tracing patterns on the walls with her fingertips, patterns that Fletcher described as reminiscent of the branching structure of limestone cave systems. The patient's physical condition was equally perplexing. Despite being provided adequate nutrition, she maintained an emaciated appearance, with a pallor that no amount of sun exposure seemed to affect. Most striking were her eyes, which Fletcher noted had developed an unusual sensitivity to light, requiring her to wear tinted glasses even in the dimly lit hospital corridors. When examined in darkness, her pupils dilated to an extent Fletcher described as medically anomalous, almost eliminating the iris entirely. During her more lucid periods, the woman provided fragmentary accounts of her experiences, which Fletcher dutifully recorded while acknowledging their likely status as delusions. She spoke of passages between spaces, of creatures that were almost human but stretched wrong, and of a hunger that consumes from within. Most consistently, she referred to the thin people, who she claimed lived inside the walls of her home, and had invited her family to join them. According to Fletcher's notes, the woman died in early 1915 of causes that remained undetermined. An autopsy revealed several physiological abnormalities, including unusually developed nocturnal vision, structural changes to the inner ear suggesting enhanced auditory capability, and a digestive system that showed signs of adaptation to a diet significantly different from the hospital fare she had been provided. Fletcher's final entry in her file expressed his conviction that whatever had affected his patient represented not mental illness as traditionally understood, but a profound transformation of unknown origin. When local historian Vernon Mitchell began researching the case in 1952, he encountered an unusual level of resistance from elderly residents who had lived in the area during the period in question. Those who acknowledged remembering the Caldwell family refused to discuss them at length, often citing superstitious concerns. One elderly woman, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Mitchell that the community had made a tacit agreement never to speak of the Caldwells after what had been discovered in the house in 1919 when it was finally torn down to make way for agricultural development. According to this woman's account, workers demolishing the structure discovered a network of narrow passages behind the walls, spaces too small for an average adult to navigate, but which appeared to have been inhabited. Wood shavings, fabric scraps, and small animal bones were found throughout these passages. Most disturbing was the discovery of crude drawings scratched into the wooden support beams, renderings of elongated human figures with hollowed eyes and mouths stretched into impossible dimensions. The demolition crew also found evidence suggesting the Caldwell family had attempted to seal themselves in the master bedroom during their final days in the house. The door had been barricaded from within, and the walls reinforced with boards apparently torn from other rooms. Inside this fortified space, they discovered a collection of makeshift weapons: kitchen knives bound to broomsticks, glass bottles fashioned into crude blades arranged in a defensive circle. Yet, whatever last stand the family might have planned had apparently never taken place, as no blood or signs of struggle were evident. Mitchell's research took a more personal turn when he discovered a connection to his own family history. His great-uncle, Silas Mitchell, had been the county doctor in 1909 and had apparently been called to the Caldwell house on at least 3 occasions in the months preceding the family's disappearance. Vernon located his great-uncle's medical journal, which contained brief notes regarding these visits. The entries described Lucinda Caldwell's complaints of hearing scuttling noises at night and her increasing insomnia. The final entry, dated April 10, 1909, mentioned Jeremiah's concern that his wife was becoming obsessed with the notion that something was living within the walls of their home. More revealing was Silas Mitchell's private correspondence, which Vernon discovered among his great-uncle's personal effects. In a letter to a medical colleague in St. Louis, dated April 12, 1909, Silas described symptoms he had observed in both Jeremiah and Lucinda Caldwell that defied his medical understanding. Both husband and wife exhibit a peculiar pallor despite their reportedly active lifestyle, and a sensitivity to daylight that necessitates drawn curtains even on overcast days. Mrs. Caldwell's hearing has become so acute that normal conversation causes her visible discomfort, while Mr. Caldwell, over my 3 visits, her frame has grown noticeably more gaunt, her movements more fluid, yet somehow angular, and her eyes have developed a reflective quality in dim light that reminds one of nocturnal animals. Silas concluded his letter by expressing his belief that the Caldwells were suffering from a condition unknown to modern medicine, possibly endemic to the limestone geography of the region, and requested information on any similar cases his colleague might have encountered. Caldwell complains of a persistent taste of limestone in his mouth, regardless of what he consumes. Most disturbing is the physical transformation evident in Mrs. No response to this inquiry was found among Silas's papers, suggesting either that none was sent or that it had been deliberately removed. What makes this case particularly compelling is how it reflects the psychological impact of isolation in the Ozark wilderness during this period. The region's dense forests and rugged terrain created natural barriers between homesteads, often leaving families to fend for themselves for weeks or months at a time. This geographical isolation, combined with the cultural resistance to outside influence that characterized Ozark communities, created perfect conditions for psychological strain to manifest in unusual ways. The Caldwells, despite their wealth, were outsiders in a tightly knit community with deep roots. Jeremiah had made his fortune by exploiting the region's natural resources, potentially earning the quiet resentment of locals who viewed the land with almost spiritual reverence. This social isolation, layered upon the physical isolation of their remote property, may explain why their disappearance generated so little official concern and why subsequent generations seemed so determined to forget them. A peculiar footnote to the story emerged in 1963 when construction workers breaking ground for a highway expansion near the former Caldwell property uncovered a sealed well containing several artifacts: a woman's high-button shoe, an antique pocket watch with its face shattered, and a metal box containing newspaper clippings about the Caldwell family's various business ventures. The box also held a journal, water-damaged but partially legible, which appeared to have belonged to Abigail Werther, one of the Caldwell servants. The journal entries that could be deciphered described an increasingly tense atmosphere in the house during the early months of 1909. Werther wrote of hearing something like fingernails dragging across the other side of the wall while working in the kitchen, and of Lucinda Caldwell's growing paranoia that the sounds followed her from room to room. The servant also noted Jeremiah's dismissive attitude toward his wife's fears, attributing them to female hysteria and too much time spent reading Gothic novels. As the weeks progressed, Werther's entries documented a gradual shift in the household dynamic. Jeremiah, initially skeptical, began to acknowledge the strange occurrences, particularly after discovering what he described as openings in the cellar wall that had not existed the day before. The family's other servant, Thaddeus Barnes, reported seeing something white and thin moving through the orchard at dusk, though Werther noted that Barnes had been drinking heavily since their arrival at the property. Most significantly, Werther recorded Lucinda's increasingly bizarre behavior. The mistress of the house began sleeping during daylight hours and wandering the halls at night, pressing her ear to the walls and whispering to what she called the listeners. She abandoned her formerly meticulous appearance, allowing her hair to grow untamed and wearing the same nightgown for days on end. The final legible entry, dated April 15, 1909, described a disturbing incident. The servant had been awakened in the night by what sounded like strange laughter, unlike any human sound I've ever heard, as if coming from a throat not meant for such expressions. Upon lighting a lamp, the servant claimed to have seen something retreating into a small crack where the wall met the floorboards. Not a rat or any creature I know, but something with fingers. Historians have offered various explanations for the events at the Caldwell house. Most disturbing was her newfound habit of scraping at the wallpaper with her fingernails, creating small tears that she would then peer through for hours at a time. Some suggest the family fell victim to the endemic violence that occasionally erupted in isolated communities, perhaps murdered by business rivals or displaced locals harboring grudges against Jeremiah's exploitative business practices. Others propose more mundane explanations that the family simply relocated without proper documentation, not unusual in a period when record-keeping in rural areas was often haphazard. The medical community has suggested that environmental factors might account for both the family's reported symptoms and their eventual disappearance. The limestone bedrock of the Ozarks can produce radon gas, which in concentrated amounts causes symptoms including hallucinations and paranoia. Contaminated well water, possibly containing heavy metals from nearby mining operations, could explain the physical transformations described in Silas Mitchell's correspondence. Psychological explanations have also been proposed, with some experts suggesting a case of shared psychosis or folie à deux between Jeremiah and Lucinda, possibly extending to their servants through the phenomenon of social contagion. The isolation of the property, combined with the suggestive power of local folklore, might have created conditions ripe for collective delusion. What these explanations fail to address is the consistent pattern of unusual experiences reported by subsequent occupants of the house, or the strange reluctance of the community to acknowledge the family's existence in later years. This collective silence suggests something more profound than a simple case of disappearance or relocation. It points to an event so disturbing that an entire community chose to excise it from their shared history. In 1968, An anthropologist named Margaret Whitley conducted interviews with descendants of families who had lived in Camden County during the early 1900s. Her research, intended to document oral traditions of the Ozark region, unexpectedly uncovered several references to the Caldwell case. These stories, passed down through generations, had evolved into a kind of cautionary tale about the dangers of building homes in certain wrong places in the hills. According to these oral accounts, the land where the Caldwell house stood had been considered unsuitable for habitation by indigenous peoples long before European settlement. Local lore suggested the limestone formations beneath the property contained extensive cave systems that served as dwelling places for entities neither fully animal nor human. These beings were said to be drawn to human habitations built above their subterranean domains, first out of curiosity, then out of hunger for something more abstract than food, a hunger for human emotion, particularly fear. Whitley's academic colleagues dismissed these stories as typical examples of rural superstition, noting similar legends existed throughout the Ozarks regarding haunted or cursed locations. However, Whitley herself was struck by the specificity of details that appeared consistently across multiple accounts, despite coming from families who claimed no knowledge of one another. Most accounts described the entities as pale, emaciated humanoid figures with disproportionately large eyes and elongated fingers, capable of squeezing through impossibly narrow spaces. One elderly informant, whose grandfather had been part of the demolition crew in 1919, provided a particularly detailed description. They weren't like any people you'd know, but they weren't animals neither. White as cave fish, with eyes big as silver dollars but all pupil, no color. Fingers long and many-jointed, like spider legs. They moved wrong, too fluid, like they had extra joints. And they were thin, Lord, they were thin, like they'd been stretched out from inside. Perhaps the most unsettling connection emerged when Whitley compared these descriptions to the journal entries from the servant discovered in the sealed well. The servant had never explicitly described what she glimpsed retreating into the wall, only that it had fingers and moved in a way that was not animal-like. Yet the oral accounts collected by Whitley presumably evolved over decades of retelling, described creatures that matched the drawings found scratched into the support beams of the house during its demolition. Whitley's research led her to a tantalizing hypothesis that the legends of subterranean entities in Ozark folklore might have originated from actual encounters with isolated human communities living in the extensive cave systems beneath the region. The limestone karst topography of the Ozarks contains thousands of documented caves, many interconnected through passages too narrow for conventional exploration. It is not implausible that individuals seeking escape from society, whether Native Americans fleeing European encroachment, escaped slaves, outlaws, or others, might have adapted to life in these underground spaces over generations. Such adaptation would naturally produce physical changes, sensitivity to light, enhanced night vision, pallor due to lack of sun exposure, and possibly skeletal adaptations to accommodate movement through confined spaces. Over time, these physical changes, combined with the psychological effects of subterranean isolation, might have created a population that appeared other to surface dwellers, not quite human by conventional standards, yet undeniably derived from human stock. This theory gained unexpected support in 1971, when cavers exploring a previously unmapped system near the former Caldwell property discovered evidence of long-term human habitation deep within the limestone. Carbon dating of charcoal from fire pits indicated continuous occupation spanning from approximately 1750 to 1920, abruptly ending around the time the Caldwell house was demolished. Among the artifacts recovered were crude tools fashioned from bone and stone, simple oil lamps made from hollowed limestone, and fragments of clothing consistent with early 20th century manufacture. Most compelling was the discovery of anatomical remains, 3 partial skeletons showing unusual adaptations, including elongated finger bones, modified hip structures suggesting comfort in a crouched position, and skull formations indicating enhanced auditory capability. Analysis by physical anthropologists suggested these adaptations were consistent with evolutionary response to a troglodytic lifestyle over multiple generations. The Caldwell case presents us with a unique intersection of documented history and folklore. While the family's disappearance is an established historical fact, supported by county records and contemporary accounts, the explanations for that disappearance range from the mundane to the supernatural. What remains consistent across all versions is the profound impact the event had on the collective psyche of the community, an impact that transformed a simple missing persons case into a deeply embedded cultural legend. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the story is not the disappearance itself, but what it reveals about human psychology in the face of isolation. The Ozarks in 1909 represented one of the last genuinely frontier regions in America, where communities existed in relative seclusion from the rapidly modernizing world beyond. In such environments, the line between reality and imagination could blur, especially during the long winter months when families were often cut off from outside contact for weeks at a time. The Caldwell house itself embodied this isolation, a grand structure built in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. Its very architecture, with its high ceilings and numerous rooms, would have created natural acoustics for the amplification of the sounds that so disturbed Lucinda Caldwell. The house's thick walls, built to withstand harsh Ozark winters, may have contained spaces between interior and exterior surfaces where animals could nest, creating the scratching sounds reported by multiple occupants. Yet these rational explanations fail to account for the more disturbing elements of the case, the consistent reports of inhuman sounds, the drawings found in the walls, and the community's subsequent reluctance to acknowledge the family's existence. These aspects suggest something beyond simple animal infestation or the psychological effects of isolation. In 1957, a geologist conducting a survey of the area discovered that the property where the Caldwell house once stood sat atop a previously unknown cave system. Exploration revealed chambers extending deep into the limestone bedrock, some bearing evidence of human habitation dating back centuries. Indigenous artifacts were recovered alongside more recent items, including a silver hairbrush bearing the initials LC, potentially connecting to Lucinda Caldwell. More disturbing were the discoveries made in the narrowest passages of the cave system, passages that would have been directly beneath the foundation of the Caldwell house. Here, researchers found small nests made of fabric scraps, wood shavings, and human hair. Analysis determined that some of the hair samples were consistent with being from a female of European descent, though no DNA testing was available at that time to confirm a connection to Lucinda Caldwell. Throughout these narrow passages, explorers documented unusual markings carved into the limestone walls, markings that anthropologist Margaret Whitley would later identify as consistent with a symbolic language described in Ozark folklore as being used by the wall people to communicate across distances through the vibrations of stone. These markings appeared most concentrated in the areas directly beneath where the Caldwell house had stood, suggesting a particular interest in that location. The cave exploration was abruptly terminated when two members of the research team experienced what they described as severe auditory hallucinations while working in the deepest chamber. Both independently reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations just beyond the reach of their headlamps. When they advanced toward the sound, it retreated further into the darkness. The project supervisor ordered the cave sealed following these incidents, citing safety concerns about potential toxic gas pockets. This geological discovery provides another layer to consider when examining the Caldwell case. If the house was indeed built directly above a cave system, it might explain the acoustic phenomena reported by the family and subsequent occupants. Sound from the caves could have traveled through fissures in the limestone, creating the impression of movement within the walls. Natural drafts from these same fissures might account for the persistent coldness noted in certain rooms. Yet the presence of the nests containing human hair suggests something more disturbing than natural acoustic phenomena. If human beings were inhabiting these caves during the period when the Caldwell house stood above them, who were they? And what was their relationship to the family that vanished? One theory proposed by folklorist Samuel Harper in his 1972 study of Ozark legends suggests that the Caldwell case may represent an instance of what anthropologists call ostension, the acting out of folklore elements in real life. Harper noted that stories of cave dwellers, or wall people, existed in Ozark oral tradition long before the Caldwell disappearance, dating back to early European settlement of the region. According to these legends, individuals who became lost in the vast cave systems beneath the Ozark plateaus sometimes adapted to underground life rather than perishing. Over generations, these subterranean communities evolved distinct physical characteristics, sensitivity to light, pale skin, and an ability to navigate in near total darkness. They were said to occasionally venture to the surface, typically at night, to gather resources from human habitations built above their underground domains. Harper suggested that individuals aware of these legends, perhaps including the Caldwell servants, might have manufactured evidence to support the folklore, either as a prank or for more sinister purposes. The strange artifacts found in the walls during demolition could have been planted there to perpetuate the legend. The disappearance of the family might have been exploited as an opportunity to breathe new life into an old story, which would explain why subsequent occupants reported similar experiences. They arrived at the property already primed to interpret any unusual occurrence through the lens of the established legend. This theory, while accounting for many elements of the case, fails to explain the physical evidence found in the caves beneath the property, the nests containing human hair that match the general description of Lucinda Caldwell. It also doesn't address the question of where the family actually went, or why county records were seemingly altered to suggest they had relocated, when no evidence of such relocation exists. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that elements of both the rational and supernatural explanations contain truth. The geological reality of the cave system beneath the property, combined with the psychological effects of isolation and the cultural context of existing folklore, created perfect conditions for a tragedy that the community later chose to obscure rather than confront directly. Consider this sequence of events. The Caldwell family, new to the area and isolated both geographically and socially, begins to experience unusual phenomena in their home. Sounds in the walls, cold spots in certain rooms. Lucinda, already predisposed to anxiety according to the doctor's notes, becomes increasingly fixated on these occurrences. Jeremiah dismisses her concerns, creating tension in the household that is observed by the servants. Meanwhile, beneath the house, the cave system is indeed inhabited, not by supernatural entities, but by human outcasts who have adapted to subterranean life. Perhaps they are remnants of indigenous groups displaced by European settlement, or fugitives from justice who found refuge in the vast underground networks of the Ozarks. These individuals, accustomed to darkness and confined spaces, could easily navigate the narrow fissures connecting the caves to the spaces between the walls of the house. As Lucinda's mental state deteriorates, these cave dwellers become aware of the turmoil above them. Perhaps they even observe the family through cracks in the floorboards or walls. Something about the situation, possibly Jeremiah's dismissive treatment of his wife's fears, triggers hostility. The cave dwellers begin to deliberately exacerbate the phenomena, moving more boldly within the walls, creating noises to disturb the household. The situation escalates until April 1909, when something catalyzes a violent confrontation. Perhaps Lucinda, in her deteriorating mental state, discovers one of the cave dwellers entering the house through a previously unnoticed access point. Perhaps Jeremiah finally acknowledges the reality of his wife's claims and attempts to investigate. Whatever the specific trigger, violence erupts, resulting in the disappearance of the family. The community, becoming aware of what transpired either through direct knowledge or rumor, makes a collective decision to obscure the truth. This might be motivated by fear of what exists beneath their own homes, fear of acknowledging a reality that threatens their understanding of the world. It might also be motivated by shame. Perhaps some community members had knowledge of the cave dwellers, but had maintained an uneasy truce with them, a truce broken by the Caldwell incident. This theory accounts for the physical evidence, the community's strange reluctance to discuss the case, and the consistent pattern of experiences reported by subsequent occupants of the property. It suggests that what happened at the Caldwell house was neither purely psychological nor supernatural, but a tragic collision of human realities. The reality of the wealthy, isolated family above ground, and the reality of the desperate, adapted outcasts below. The most compelling evidence supporting this interpretation came to light in 1969, when renovations to the Camden County Courthouse uncovered a hidden compartment in the wall of the recorder's office. The statement, never formally entered into public record, acknowledged the discovery of evidence of habitation within the walls and beneath the foundation of the Caldwell house, and the recovery of remains consistent with those of an adult male, adult female, and two others of indeterminate nature. The statement went on to assert that, for the peace of mind of the county's citizens and the preservation of property values, all official documentation regarding the incident would be modified to indicate the family had relocated. Inside was a sealed metal box containing a single document, a handwritten statement signed by 12 county officials, dated June 1909. The signatories vowed never to speak of what they had found, and to ensure the property remained unoccupied for as long as possible. This document, if authentic, confirms that something tragic did indeed occur at the Caldwell house, something the authorities deemed too disturbing to acknowledge publicly. It suggests that the bodies of Jeremiah and Lucinda Caldwell were recovered, along with two others of indeterminate nature, and presumably the servants, though the phrasing leaves room for alternative interpretations. What it doesn't explain is who, or what, was responsible for these deaths. The reference to evidence of habitation within the walls and beneath the foundation supports the theory of cave dwellers, but doesn't clarify whether these individuals were ordinary human outcasts, or something that the officials found difficult to categorize within their understanding of humanity. In 1972, the last remaining section of the original Caldwell property was purchased by a developer planning to build a vacation resort. During preliminary excavation, workers uncovered a sealed entrance to the cave system that had been documented in the 1957 Geological Survey. Modern exploration techniques allowed for more thorough investigation of the network, revealing chambers that extended for miles beneath the surrounding countryside. In the deepest chamber yet discovered, researchers found a small collection of personal items arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate display: a woman's hairbrush, a man's pocket watch, a set of house keys, and a journal with yellowing pages. The journal contained detailed drawings of what appeared to be architectural plans for the Caldwell house, with particular attention paid to the spaces between walls and beneath floorboards. Written across one page in a spidery hand were the words, "They watch us from inside the walls." Carbon dating of organic material found near these items suggested they had been placed there somewhere between 1909 and 1912, corresponding with the period immediately following the Caldwell disappearance. Analysis of hair samples found in the brush matched the general type expected from a woman of European descent, though again, no DNA comparison was possible due to the absence of confirmed Caldwell remains. The discovery reignited interest in the case among historians and folklorists, leading to a more systematic effort to collect oral histories from elderly residents of the region who might have heard first-hand accounts passed down through their families. These interviews, conducted primarily between 1973 and 1975, revealed a consistent narrative that had never been formally documented, but appeared to be widely known among certain families in the area. According to these accounts, the Caldwell house had been built on land that local indigenous peoples had specifically warned early settlers to avoid. The limestone formations in that particular area were said to contain unusually narrow passages connecting surface chambers to deeper cave systems, allowing for movement between the underground world and the surface. These passages were supposedly used by entities that indigenous mythology described as neither human nor animal, but something in between, beings that had once been human but had adapted to subterranean life over many generations. The oral histories suggested that local settlers had maintained an uneasy coexistence with these beings for decades before the Caldwells arrived. By unspoken agreement, certain areas were left undeveloped, particularly the region where the Caldwell house was eventually built. When Jeremiah Caldwell purchased the land in 1905, reportedly at a surprisingly low price, longtime residents attempted to dissuade him from building there, though without explicitly stating their concerns. As construction of the house progressed, workers reported tools going missing, strange sounds emanating from newly excavated foundation holes, and an unusual number of accidents. Several workers refused to continue on the project, citing bad feelings about the location. Jeremiah, dismissing these concerns as superstitious nonsense, simply hired replacements from outside the local community to complete the construction. According to these oral accounts, the Caldwell family experienced increasing disturbances from the moment they occupied the house. What began as subtle sounds in the walls escalated to items being moved or disappearing entirely, culminating in direct encounters with the entities, described consistently as pale, emaciated humanoid figures with oversized eyes adapted for darkness. These encounters primarily affected Lucinda and the servants, while Jeremiah reportedly continued to dismiss their claims until shortly before the family's disappearance. The most disturbing element of these oral histories was the suggestion that the Caldwells were not killed, as the courthouse document implied, but were taken into the cave system alive. Various accounts described a ritual whereby surface dwellers who had seen the cave entities were given a choice: death or assimilation into the subterranean community. Those who chose assimilation were said to undergo a transformation, gradually adapting to underground life until they became indistinguishable from those who had dwelled beneath the surface for generations. If these accounts contain any truth, they suggest a fate for the Caldwell family far more disturbing than simple murder. They imply that Jeremiah, Lucinda, and their servants may have continued to exist beneath the very community that chose to forget them, perhaps even participating in the ongoing interaction between the surface world and the world below. This interpretation would explain the placement of the personal items found in the deep cave chamber, not as trophies taken from victims, but as mementos of former lives voluntarily left behind. It would also explain the community's profound reluctance to discuss the case, motivated not just by fear of what lurked beneath their homes, but by the more disturbing possibility that those they had known in life might now be transformed into something other than human. The veracity of these oral histories is, of course, impossible to confirm. They may represent genuine folk memories of actual events, or they may be examples of how factual occurrences become mythologized over time, incorporating elements of existing folklore to create narratives that satisfy deeper psychological and cultural needs. What remains undisputed is the impact the Caldwell case had on the community, an impact so profound that its echoes were still detectable in local culture more than 6 decades later. In the end, the story of the Caldwell house stands as a testament to the power of isolation to transform both individual psychology and collective memory. In the remote Ozark wilderness of 1909, far from the industrialized cities rapidly defining American culture, reality itself seemed more permeable. The boundaries between history and folklore, between rational explanation and supernatural belief, blurred in ways that modern sensibilities struggle to comprehend. Perhaps this is why the case continues to fascinate more than a century later. In an age of constant connection and surveillance, where isolation has become a luxury rather than a condition of existence, the Caldwell story reminds us of a time when humans could still vanish completely, when houses could contain secrets never fully revealed, and when communities could collectively choose to forget what they could not bear to remember. The former Caldwell property remains undeveloped to this day. The vacation resort planned in the 1970s was never completed, the developer citing geological instability as the official reason for abandoning the project. Local residents know better than to venture there after dark. They say that sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, the sound of knocking can be heard emanating from beneath the ground. Not the random knocking of settling earth or shifting stones, but the deliberate pattern of something trying to communicate. They say that if you listen carefully enough, you might hear what sounds like voices calling from below, voices speaking words just slightly too distorted to understand. And they say that if you answer those calls, you might receive a response in kind. But no one who has ever done so has remained to tell what message was conveyed. In 1985, a team from the University of Missouri attempted to conduct a more thorough archaeological investigation of the cave system, employing modern technology, including ground-penetrating radar and remote-controlled exploration devices. Their initial surveys confirmed what previous researchers had discovered: an extensive network of chambers and passages, many showing evidence of long-term human habitation. What distinguished this exploration from earlier efforts was the discovery of a previously unmapped section extending more than a mile beyond the farthest point reached in the 1972 survey. This remote area contained chambers with ceiling heights of up to 30 feet, spacious enough to accommodate a substantial community. Evidence of organized living arrangements was abundant: designated areas for food preparation, sleeping spaces lined with dried grasses and fabric, and most remarkably, a sophisticated system for collecting and storing water from underground springs. Carbon dating of artifacts found in these chambers suggested continuous occupation from approximately 1800 to 1920, with a sharp decline in evidence of habitation after that point. The researchers theorized that whatever community had dwelled in these caves had either died out, relocated, or been assimilated back into surface society around the time the Caldwell house was demolished. Most intriguing was the discovery of written records, dozens of journal-like entries scratched into slate tablets, utilizing a symbolic language that linguists have still not fully deciphered. The few symbols that have been translated suggest a community with a complex understanding of their environment, including detailed mapping of the cave system and tracking of surface activities above them. References to upper dwellers appear frequently, often in contexts suggesting observation and occasional interaction. Several of these slate tablets appear to document the construction and occupation of a large structure directly above the central chamber, almost certainly the Caldwell house. The entries become more frequent and seemingly urgent during a period corresponding to early 1909, with repetition of symbols that linguists believe they'd represent breach, exposure, and decision. The final tablet, based on its position in the chronological sequence, contains a series of symbols that remain completely untranslated, along with what appears to be a crude rendering of human figures descending from an architectural structure into a series of oval chambers. Whether this represents a record of the Caldwell family's fate or something else entirely remains a subject of intense debate among researchers familiar with the case. The Caldwell case remains officially unsolved. The house is long gone, the family forgotten by all but a few historians and folklorists with particular interest in the obscure corners of Ozark history. Yet something of their story persists in the collective memory of the region, not as documented fact, but as the kind of tale told around campfires, a cautionary story about building homes in places where humans were never meant to dwell, and about the dangers of dismissing the fears of those who insist they hear something moving within the walls. In the limestone caves beneath what was once the Caldwell property, darkness reigns eternal. And in that darkness, perhaps, something still waits, patient, adapted, and very, very hungry. For what, we may never truly know. The most recent development in the Caldwell case occurred in 2015, when a hiker reported finding a crudely constructed shelter in the woods approximately a half-mile from the former house site. Inside the shelter was an old leather journal, its pages brittle with age, but still legible. The journal appeared to have been written sometime in the 1930s by someone identifying themselves only as LCJ, potentially Lucinda Caldwell's initials, with an unknown third designation. The journal contained disjointed entries describing a life split between the upper world and the chambers below. It spoke of a community that had developed its own customs, language, and social structure, adapting to subterranean existence while maintaining limited contact with the surface world. Most disturbing were passages suggesting that new members were still being brought into this community well into the 20th century, individuals who had seen too much and been given the choice. Authorities dismissed the journal as an elaborate hoax, noting inconsistencies in the paper aging and ink composition. Yet local residents who have read copies of the text report an unsettling familiarity in the descriptions of life beneath the surface, details that align too closely with oral traditions passed down through generations to be mere coincidence. Perhaps we will never know the full truth of what happened to the Caldwell family in those spring days of 1909. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, existing in that liminal space between history and legend, where the human mind is free to contemplate possibilities too disturbing for certainty. What we do know is that somewhere in the Ozark Hills, a house once stood where a family vanished without explanation. And beneath that house, passages led into darkness, a darkness that may have contained nothing more than limestone and silence, or perhaps something that continues to watch and wait for those who build their homes in places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. For those who find themselves driving the back roads of Camden County on quiet nights, locals still offer the same advice. Don't stop at clearings where nothing grows. Don't listen too carefully to sounds that might be coming from beneath your feet. And if you hear something knocking from within your walls, pretend you never heard it. For acknowledging such sounds is the first step toward a choice no one should ever have to make.